Las Vegas, Nevada. September 12th, 2019, a hot and vibrant night in Las Vegas. The city streets were packed with tourists, flashing lights, and the constant sound of casino machines filled the air. Emily Thompson, 32, was in town for a weekend getaway with her friends, celebrating one of their friends' birthdays. Married to Michael for 5 years, Emily has always led a predictable and safe life, but that night, something was about to change. The group of friends, after a few hours in restaurants and bars, decided to stop by one of the hottest strip clubs in Vegas, just for fun. Just for laughs, one of them commented, and Emily, a little reluctant at first, ended up giving in. After all, we were in Vegas. What could happen? As soon as she entered the club, Emily was greeted by an explosion of loud music, flashing lights, and a sensual atmosphere. Women danced on stage, while men and women, drunk and dazed by the city of sin, screamed and applauded their every move. Emily felt a slight sense of discomfort, but it was soon overcome by the collective emotion of the room. It was something new, something she wasn't used to experiencing. The friends sat near the stage, ordered more drinks, and came to watch the show. The laughter began to flow, along with the provocative comments about the dancers. However, one of the strippers caught Emily's attention in a way she didn't expect. Vanessa, blonde, tall, with a sculpted body and an air of tempting confidence, danced on stage with almost hypnotic solutions. Her movements were calculated, sensual, and each gesture seemed carefully designed to capture everyone's gaze. But in that moment, it seemed like she was dancing just for Emily. At first, Emily tried to ignore it, looking away and laughing with her friends, but she couldn't help but notice that Vanessa was looking straight into her eyes. The eye contact lasted seconds that felt like hours. Emily felt her heart race, and her mouth went dry. A feeling of heat began to rise through her body, something she couldn't control. She was being watched in a way she never had been before. After the show, as her friends got up to go to the bar, Emily stayed behind a little, feeling a strange pull that pulled her back to the stage. She looked around, trying to understand what was happening to her, but before she could reason, Vanessa appeared in front of her. "Did you like the show?" Vanessa asked with a mischievous smile. His voice was soft, but carried an almost intimidating confidence. Emily froze for a moment, not knowing how to respond. Her heart was beating so hard, she could hear the sound in her ears. "It was interesting," Emily replied, trying to sound casual, but her voice shook slightly. Vanessa moved more, her words almost whispered. "Interesting, huh? I think we can do more than that." Emily felt a mixture of fear and excitement. Something inside her screamed to get out of there, but at the same time, she felt trapped in that moment. Vanessa, realizing the effect she was having, gently took Emily's hand and moved her closer to the bar. Emily looked around, her friends were distracted, laughing and flirting with some men at the counter. She knew she was about to cross a line, but at that moment, there seemed to be no going back. Vanessa ordered 2 drinks and handed one to Emily. "So, you're in Vegas for fun?" he asked, with a smile that seemed to know more than he let on. Emily took a large sip of her drink, trying to relax, but her hands were sweaty. "Yes, with some friend's birthday," he replied, looking away. She wasn't sure how to behave, but something kept her there. Vanessa leaned in closer. "You look different from all these people," he said, watching Emily closely. "I can see you're not like them. You're stuck in a life you don't want, aren't you?" The words pierced Emily in a way she hadn't expected. Was she trapped? Was that what made you feel so attracted to that situation? Before I could respond, Vanessa grabbed his hand more firmly. "I can show you something different. How about we get out of here when the show is over?" Emily, driven by alcohol and the feeling of adrenaline, found herself nodding in agreement. She knew she was about to make a mistake, but that night, in Vegas, anything seemed possible. The show ended, and Vanessa guided Emily out of the club. The warm lights of the city seemed even more extended outside, and the desert breeze enveloped it. Emily felt her body shaking, not from the cold, but from the anticipation of what was to come. Vanessa took a taxi, and the two left for a destination that Emily didn't know, but that would change her life forever. Without knowing it, Michael was already starting to get suspicious. The clock struck 3:30 in the morning, and the streets of Las Vegas were slowly calming down, but Michael Thompson's mind was on fire. He was sitting on the couch at home, staring at his cell phone, waiting for a message or a call from Emily. She had stopped responding around midnight, something completely out of the ordinary. Michael knew that Emily was in town with her friends, celebrating one of their friends' birthdays, but that nagging feeling that something was wrong or was consuming him inside. Over the past few months, Michael has noticed changes in Emily. She was more distant, more distracted, as if her mind was always somewhere else. He tried to confront her a few times, but she always denied any problems, saying it was stress from work. Despite this, Michael decided to follow his instincts and hire a private investigator to track Emily's steps during her outings. He never imagined he would receive a message that night. At 4 a.m., Michael's cell phone vibrated. It was a notification from the investigator. He picked up the phone in a hurry, his heart racing, and opened the message. What he saw paralyzed him. They were photos. Emily, his wife, was not at the strip club. In the images, she was talking to a blonde stripper, the two holding hands and in an intimate atmosphere. Michael felt his stomach drop. How could she? He zoomed in on the photos, analyzing every detail, trying to find an explanation for what he saw. The stripper, Vanessa, seemed completely at ease with Emily, and his wife seemed equally interested. Michael felt the blood rush to his head. He breathed heavily, trying to process the betrayal he was seeing before his eyes. Anger overcame him, and he left the house, grabbing his car keys tightly. He can no longer think clearly. Only one thing was on his mind: finding Emily. As Michael drove through the deserted streets of Vegas, the investigators' messages continued to arrive. A new sequence of photos showed Emily and Vanessa leaving the club, laughing and hugging as they got into a taxi. The detective took them to a small hotel nearby, where they both entered and disappeared for over an hour. Michael opened the steering wheel with force, his mind being filled with anger and the desire for revenge. He was never the impulsive type of man. He always remained calm in stressful situations, but at that moment, he was at his limit. The feeling of humiliation or corrosion. The images kept playing in his mind like flashes from a nightmare. At the hotel, Emily was in a state of euphoria and confusion. Vanessa had been pulled into a world she had never imagined, a world of freedom, excitement, and danger. The two stayed together, and for Emily, it seemed like a forbidden adventure, a secret that she would never tell anyone. But while she was with Vanessa, something inside her also felt a pang of guilt. How could I explain that to Michael? How could he continue his life as if nothing had happened? But at that moment, Emily shook off those thoughts. She was drunk, numb to the emotion of the moment, and Vanessa's presence made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew she had crossed a line, but she wasn't ready to face the consequences.
Not yet.
Meanwhile, Michael continued his pursuit. He arrived at the hotel just before 5 a.m., parking the car on a side street, out of sight. He informed the entrance carefully, expecting to see Emily come out. His thoughts were in a whirl, wondering what she could be doing inside. With every second, his patience grew thinner. He provides a cell phone once again, seeing the investigators' latest messages. They're still in the room. At 5:15 a.m., Michael saw the hotel door open. There they were, Emily and Vanessa left together, laughing and talking, without realizing they were being seen. Michael saw his wife, slouch and smiling, an expression he hadn't seen in a while. Something inside him circumscribes itself at that moment. The anger he had been holding back or completely controlling. He got out of the car, his fists clenched, and started walking towards the two. Michael's heart was pounding, and adrenaline coursed through his veins. He was ready to confront Emily, to demand answers. He never prepared for betrayal. He never believed his wife would be capable of something like this. Emily and Vanessa had their backs to Michael when he finally agreed. Emily. The two stopped immediately. Emily froze at the sound of her husband's voice. Her heart sank into her chest, and all the brightness of that night disappeared in an instant. She knew she couldn't run away now. What she had feared all night had happened. She turned around slowly, her face feeling hot and her stomach churning. Vanessa, sensing the tension in the air, took a step back. She wasn't used to confrontations like this, and she could feel the imminent danger in Michael's eyes. Michael moved quickly, his eyes fixed on Emily, furious and incredulous. "What are you doing with her?" he said, pointing at Vanessa. Emily, unable to articulate a response, sits as tears fill her eyes. She knew there was no justification, that words would be useless at that moment. The tension wasn't palpable, and Vanessa, realizing she was in unfamiliar territory, began to recover. "Maybe I should go," she whispered to Emily, trying to take in the scene, but Michael took a step toward her, his anger now completely focused on her. "You destroyed my marriage," he understands, and Vanessa, scared, excited about the situation, raising her hands in a sign of surrender. But it was too late for negotiations. What started as a secret betrayal was about to turn into something much darker. And at that moment, a tragedy began to unfold. The streets of Las Vegas were still quiet, with only the distant sound of cars and the warm desert breeze to break the early morning silence. Emily, Vanessa Storm, and Michael were not at the center of an emotion. The confrontation had begun, and, with it, the cruel reality of the situation set in. Michael, with his eyes fixed on Emily, was completely overcome with anger. His hands were shaking, and his breathing was uneven. He couldn't believe that the woman he had been with for the last few years of his life was in someone else's arms. The image of betrayal was burned into his mind, and now he had to deal with the pain in a way he couldn't fully understand. "How could you do this to me, Emily?" Michael spoke, his voice a shared mess of pain and anger. He looked at Vanessa, who was a few steps behind Emily, her expression one of fear and confusion. Vanessa seemed to want to run away, but something kept her there, paralyzed by tension and imminent fear. Emily, in a state of panic, tried to get closer to Michael. "Michael, please listen to me. It's not what it seems." But Michael wasn't willing to listen to explanations. He was overwhelmed with emotions, and the sight of Emily in another woman's arms was more than he could bear. "You have nothing more to say, Emily. I've seen enough," he interrupted, his words cutting through the air like knives. Vanessa, realizing that the situation was rapidly deteriorating, tried to intervene, placing herself between Michael and Emily. "Please don't do this. Let's resolve this without violence." Her voice was tremendous, and she held out her hand in a gesture of appeasement. Michael, however, was beyond reason. He ignored Vanessa and advanced towards Emily. The intensity of the confrontation made the room seem small, and despair took over Michael. He had brought a knife to defend himself in any situation that might arise, something he carried frequently due to his profession. Now the knife was in his hand, and the blade gleamed in the streetlights. Emily, terrified, took a step back, her legs shaking. She tried to grab Vanessa, hoping that her presence might provide some form of protection. "Vanessa, let's get out of here." Emily, quite desperate. Vanessa tried to pull Emily away, but Michael had made up his mind and had no intention of returning. "Get out of my sight." He's sincere, his face contorted into a mask of fury. The words that came out of his mouth held information of a pain he couldn't control. The confrontation seemed surprising. Michael advanced with a knife raised, and Vanessa, trying to protect Emily, helped to clear the way. In a quick and desperate movement, Vanessa stretched out her arms to protect Emily, but Michael was out of control, and the instinct of anger took over his actions. The first blow was quick and precise. Michael, in a fit of rage, struck Vanessa with the knife, the sound of the impact and Vanessa's scream of pain echoing through the deserted street. She fell to the ground, her body contorted in an expression of pain. Blood was left on the sidewalk, and the scene became a chaos of violence and screams. Emily, horrified, fell to her knees beside Vanessa. She tried to stop the bleeding. Her hands were covered in the hot, sticky fluid. "No, no, Vanessa, please don't." Emily cried, her screams echoing down the street. She was completely in shock, unable to predict what was happening. Michael, still with the knife in his hand, was now panting and stunned. He watched Vanessa's body, the reality of what he had done begin to set in. The silence after the attack was oppressive, and Michael began to feel the gravity of his actions. The anger that before consumption has now been overcome by a sense of terror and regret. At that moment, the sound of police sirens began to approach. Someone called the police, and officers were in the way. Emily, in a state of complete panic, kept trying to help Vanessa, but there wasn't much she could do. Time seemed to drag by as the situation unfolded. Michael, realizing there was nothing more he could do, threw the knife to the ground, his hands now shaking. He knew it was over. The weight of what he had done fell on him like a ton of stone. He turned around, putting himself in a surrender position. There was no longer any way to escape the consequences of his actions. When the police arrived, they found a terrifying scene. Michael was standing over Vanessa's body, his eyes empty and full of regret. Emily was kneeling next to Vanessa, crying and trying to comprehend the magnitude of the tragedy that had unfolded. Officers quickly controlled the scene, taking Michael to the squad car and beginning to investigate what had happened. The crime scene was a harrowing sight, marked by violence and betrayal. The case quickly gained media attention, and the city of Las Vegas was shocked by what had happened. As Michael was taken to the police station, the reality was that it had taken hold. A night that began with promises of fun and adventure turned into a deadly nightmare. Emily, devastated, was scarred by the night forever, knowing that her decision to cross that path led to an irreversible tragedy. The lights of the police sirens still illuminated the street where Vanessa's blood was beginning to dry on the sidewalk. The city of Las Vegas, known for its excesses and festivities, was now plunged into an unexpected and terrible crisis. Michael Thompson, the man who took the night to the extreme, was about to face the consequences of his actions. After being handcuffed and placed in the squad car, Michael was taken to the police station. The silence in the back of the squad car was oppressive, broken only by the sound of the engine and Michael's heavy breathing. He was in shock, unable to fully process what had happened. The images of Vanessa fell, Emily's scream, and the horrified looks of people passing by continued to haunt his mind. At the police station, Michael was placed in a cell and left alone to ponder what to do. The cold walls and distant footsteps of police officers were a constant reminder of their new reality. He tried to remember the night's events, but the memory was fragmented, marked by intensity of emotion and violence. Meanwhile, Emily was taken to hospital to be treated for minor injuries and emotional shock. She was disoriented and devastated, not knowing how to deal with the tragedy that had unfolded. The loss of Vanessa, the pain of seeing her husband in such an out-of-control state, and the feeling of guilt for starting the emotional turmoil were weighing on her. The next day brought a wave of media. Michael Thompson's case was all over the news, and the city was shocked by the brutality of the crime. Television cameras and reporters surrounded the police station, searching for details about what had led to such a horrendous act. Michael became a dark example of how anger and jealousy can culminate in extreme violence. Michael's defense attorney, a man experienced in high-profile cases, prepared himself to handle the situation. He knew the task would be difficult, with the evidence against Michael overwhelming. The crime scene photos, Emily's testimony, and the police officer's statements formed a body of evidence that would be difficult to refute. At the preliminary hearing, Michael was visibly shaken. He felt like he was in an endless nightmare. The courtroom was full of reporters and onlookers, all eager to see the fall of a man who had become the center of attention. Michael looked out at the audience, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hopelessness. He knew that the words he could say would not be enough to reverse what he had done. During the hearing, the prosecutor presented evidence convincingly. Crime scene photos, Emily's statements, and text and phone call records were all used to build a solid case against Michael. The picture of a man consumed by rage and betrayal was clearly painted, and the jury seemed to be in that he was bad. Michael had the opportunity to speak in his defense. With a tremendous voice and a clear face, he spoke and told the court, I'm sorry. There aren't enough words to express how sorry I am about what happened.
I don't know what happened to me that night.
I lost control. He tried to explain, but his words were empty, and not I managed to capture the depth of what he had caused. Emily was called to testify. She declared herself, her face pale and her eyes full of tears. She spoke about the betrayal, the confrontation, and the brutality of the attack. Her words were a painful reminder of the tragedy that occurred and the loss she suffered. Michael's trial continued for several weeks. Each day, the weight of evidence accumulated, and the prospect of a future in prison seemed important. The defense tried to argue that Michael was under intense emotional influence and did not act with full awareness, but the jury seemed unforgiving. The crime was too shocking to ignore. Finally, the verdict was announced. Michael was sentenced to death in the second degree. The courtroom was filled with a heavy atmosphere of tension and sadness. Michael responded to the sentence with a blank stare, as if he was trying to absorb the magnitude of the decision to change his life forever. Michael was taken to a state prison, where he faced a long sentence. The impact of the sentence was immense, and he knew he had lost everything that was important to him. The wife he loved, the life he had built, and the freedom he once had were now all beyond his reach. The price for his anger and jealousy had been high, and he was about to serve the sentence for his brutal actions. As Michael adapted to the new reality of his prison life, the city of Las Vegas continued to move forward, even though the tragedy left a deep scar. Emily, now trying to rebuild her life, dealt with the pain and trauma of a night that changed everything. Michael's fall was not just an isolated episode, but a grim reminder of the devastating impact a moment of anger can have on people's lives. The case left an indelible mark on everyone involved, and the city of Las Vegas would never forget the night a simple birthday celebration turned into a deadly nightmare. Michael Thompson's trial began with a tense and included atmosphere. The courtroom filled with reporters, lawyers, and onlookers, all eager to watch the unfolding of a case that shocked Las Vegas and attracted national media attention. Michael, now a prisoner, faced the final leg of his downfall, and the courtroom prepared to hear the full account of the tragedy that occurred that fateful night. The judge, a woman with an austere expression and experience in highly complex cases, presidency or trial. Michael sat next to his defense attorney, a middle-aged man who appeared to be struggling under the weight of the evidence and the public outcry. The prosecutor, an ambitious and determined young man, prepared to present his case against Michael with the full force of the law. The prosecutor began his argument with a clear and compelling summary of the events of the night of the crime. He described in detail Emily's betrayal, the violent confrontation, and Vanessa's death. Using the evidence collected, such as photos of the crime scene, witness statements, and recordings of emergency calls, the prosecutor constructed a relentless narrative. He emphasized Michael's coldness and brutality, portraying him as a man consumed by rage and unable to control his impulses. The evidence presented included graphic photos of Vanessa lying on the sidewalk, her injuries, and the bloody crime scene. The prosecutor detailed the accounts of witnesses who heard the screams and saw the violence unfold. Each piece of evidence was a piece of the puzzle that pointed to Michael's guilt. The narrative involved betrayal, confrontation, and remorseless violence, and the prosecutor made a point of highlighting the absence of any sign of regret on the defendant's part at that time. Michael's defense attorney, aware of the strength of the prosecutor's case, tried to take a different approach. He argued that Michael had acted under tremendous emotional pressure and that his mind was compromised by jealousy and pain. The defense sought to present Michael as a victim of his own uncontrolled emotions, not as a calculating criminal. The defense attorney brought witnesses to court who sought to contextualize Michael's behavior. Some friends and family spoke about the difficulty Michael had in dealing with stress and pressure. They described Michael as someone who always strived to do right, but who, that night, had been consumed by an intense feeling of betrayal. The defense tried to argue that Michael did not intend to kill, but rather to confront Emily and Vanessa. Emily was called to testify. She entered the courtroom, her presence causing a wave of sympathy among the public and visible evidence in the public. The pain in her eyes and the tremor in her voice as she described the terrible night were palpable. She recounted the confusion and fear she felt when Michael appeared and how Vanessa tried to protect him. Her description of what happened was detailed and emotional, and the tears she shed as she spoke added a layer of detail to her testimony. Vanessa, who had survived the attack, was also called to talk about the night's events. Although her injuries were not fatal, it does affect the psychological impact the attack had on her life. The courage and determination she testified to were a contrast to the suffering she had experienced, and her words were a crucial part of the prosecution. The trial also included testimony from police officers and forensic experts who analyzed the crime scene. They described evidence found at the scene, how Michael had used the knife, and Emily's attempt to help Vanessa. The police officers' words reinforced the seriousness of Michael's act and the devastating impact it had on the lives of everyone involved. During the trial, Michael remained silent for the most part, observing the courtroom with an expression of resignation and regret. At times, he seemed to try to understand the implications of his actions and the weight of the evidence that was accumulating against him. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, and the room was filled with a sense of anticipation as the parties prepared for the final phase of the trial. At the end of the trial, Michael's defense attorney made one last attempt to appeal to the jury for leniency. He argued that Michael was deeply remorseful and that he had recognized the seriousness of his actions. He asked the jury to consider the extreme emotional pressure Michael had experienced and the lack of premeditation. The lawyer asked that Michael be treated with some attention to his disturbed emotional state. The prosecutor, on the other hand, gave a final speech that emphasized the need for justice for Vanessa and the seriousness of the crime. He asked the jury not to be swayed by sympathy and to consider the brutal nature of the attack. He highlighted that although Michael was in a disturbed emotional state, the act of violence was conscious and deliberate, and society needed a response commensurate with the severity of the crime. Finally, the jury was retired to deliberate the verdict. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as they waited for jurors to return. Michael sat in his chair, his mind full of tumultuous thoughts and palpable anxiety. He knew that the decision the jurors would make would irrevocably define his future. When the jury returned, the verdict was read. Michael Thompson was convicted of second-degree death, with a prison sentence that reflected the seriousness of the crime. The judge ruled that Michael had acted with an intention to cause harm, even if it was not premeditated. The sentence brought partial closure to the case, but the pain and consequences of the fateful night would continue to reverberate for a long time. Michael would face years in prison, while Emily and those around her would begin trying to find a way to deal with the trauma and loss the tragedy had caused. The trial was the end of a dark chapter, but also the beginning of a new reality for everyone involved.